All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, September 27th, 1986, NBA star Isaiah Thomas, point guard for the Detroit Pistons, has an idea for the city of Detroit. Thomas has launched a community event called No Crime Day. I don't think I need to explain much more about the concept. Thomas was encouraging the entire city to go one day without committing crimes. Detroit and many other cities were suffering from high levels of crime and violence in this era. This was Thomas's attempt to work with city and community leaders to shine a light and effect some change. He tried to get other NBA players and cities involved, but generally this was a Detroit-focused initiative, one that I would say has largely been forgotten until maybe recently, because Josh Levin of Slate is the host of their series 1 Year, which focuses on a bunch of stories from an interesting year. The latest season, full of stories from 1986, including the tale of No Crime Day. And Josh, you've been on the show a bunch of times, but welcome back. Thanks for doing this.
Always great to be here, Jody. Hi, Jody.
And I will say that the season on 1986 is just wrapping up now, so you can go and listen to that, not just the No Crime Day episode, but all sorts of other stories. With us, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Should we just ask the obvious question right off the bat, Josh? On No Crime Day, there were crimes, right?
There were crimes, yeah. And I didn't want this episode to be a gotcha.
Yeah.
Because that was kind of what some of the tenor of the media coverage was back then, was not necessarily ha-ha, but just like, this didn't work and Detroit is a failed city and let's use this as a kind of another example of dunking on Detroit. I don't know if Isaiah Thomas actually got dunked on. He was a smaller guy, but I'm sure it happened once or twice. But yeah, we did speak with rather extensively the surviving relatives, in one case, the partner of people who were actually killed on No Crime Day, in addition to speaking with Isaiah Thomas and the architects of it for the city. So we were able to get all of those perspectives.
It was so fascinating listening to this because you hear the concept of No Crime Day, and I have to say my immediate response was, this sounds very sweet and this sounds very naive. And yet you have Thomas, who's young, right? He's like 25, who is going out there and really just lobbying people around Detroit, not just through the media, but actually going out on the street and saying, hey, listen, there's going to be this one day where if we can not sell drugs and we can not commit murders and not rob anyone, we can show that it is possible to not have crime in Detroit. And there's something so hopeful about that, even though at the same time, like from the beginning, it feels so doomed.
Yeah. I mean, what I think is disturbing to me is that if you think about like the Moynihan Report and you think about like how Detroit is a very black city, and the idea that crime and blackness are interconnected and that this is somehow a part of black culture. So Isaiah Thomas just saying like, let's just do better. Like, let's just take personal responsibility. Like, it's just as easy as that. We just all need to have solidarity and get on board. Also, I think it reinforces ideas about like the cultural pathology and all of these like problematic ideas associated with Blackness and crime.
Yeah, so the origins of No Crime Day, it was bigger in Detroit and got more attention because of Isaiah's celebrity than it did anywhere. But Isaiah's from Chicago, and he got the idea from the city of Chicago, where the No Crime Day concept, which was supported by Mayor Harold Washington, it was started by the founder of this black hair care company. His name was Edward Gardner. And he said, in a way that I think we would view as kind of problematic now, that we need to replace black on black crime with black on black love. This is a black man. This is a black man saying this. And all the people that we interviewed for our episode were black. And we had perspectives from the woman who was the head of the campaign in Detroit, from Isaiah, from a police officer, from the sisters of a young man who was killed. And you hear all of these perspectives that were so prevalent in the 80s and that kind of led, I think, to the attitudes that James Foreman writes about in Locking Up Our Own, just this idea of being simultaneously over-policed and under-policed. The idea of, there are drugs that are destroying our community, but incarceration is a huge problem too. And then one of the things that I was so fascinated about and had a really good conversation with Georgiella Muirhead, who is the public information director, is this idea that Detroit is being called the murder capital of the U.S. Are you worried that you're pathologizing the members of your community by calling attention to crime there, by going out and talking to people and saying, don't commit crimes? And she said, at that point, what our main concern is just like trying something to fix the problem. We were less concerned about PR in that moment than in doing something, because hopelessness was a major problem too.
But this, can you just paint the picture of this sort of larger, we've been hinting at it, but this larger notion of, crime as a personal failing and a personal choice, and it makes me think of Just Say No, right? Where the approach is it's just that simple, right? It's just a choice, just say no instead of yes, and just don't commit a crime instead of committing a crime. It's that simple. That it feels like a very 80s approach.
Super
and so,
80s.
Was it inevitable that they were going to do No Crime Day as opposed to, Better Social Services Day or something more systemic?
Yeah, and that was one of the main criticisms of both Isaiah and Detroit Mayor Coleman Young, was the kind of lack of a more kind of animating structural idea or concept or plan here, that this was just a public service campaign. But I would say two things, specific things to that, Jody. You can hear some of the public service announcements in our episode, and one of them is from Bill Cosby and Felicia Rashad. And this was a very kind of Bill Cosby notion, right, of personal responsibility, of like, why don't you be more like Claire and Cliff Huxtable? This was 86 was like peak Cosby show. Like, it was #1 show in America. And so a pronouncement coming from him was a big deal. And I think he was the kind of, or one of the leading promoters of this notion of Black respectability. Like, we just need to do better. The other thing is, one of the moments that really inspired Isaiah here is one I think you're very familiar with, Jody, from some of your other work, is Len Bias's overdose death, which there are enormous consequences in America from his cocaine overdose. You can kind of trace the crack powder sentencing disparity to that. And
it was called the Len Bias bill. That big omnibus bill was called the Len Bias bill. Yeah.
And so it wasn't just Isaiah Thomas. People around America are looking at this and saying, like, we need to do something. And so I just think in this moment, there was, on the one hand, I mentioned it before, the sense of like, things are so screwed up right now that really we can't do anything. And this other sense, and Isaiah, I think, is just an inherently, he grew up in just really stark circumstances in Chicago, but he's, I think strikes me as a fairly optimistic person. And so he's like, I'm Isaiah Thomas. I can do this. I'm gonna, or at least I'm going to try to do this when other people aren't trying to to do things. And I came up out of my bad circumstances. And so I'm just going to go out and talk to people and say they can do it too. That sort of attitude.
Yeah, I think that's where I see the naivete, because as I was listening to it, I was thinking about, like, why do people commit crimes? Have those reasons gone away? If somebody is addicted, can they really go a day without having drugs in their system? If they are hungry and they need to have food, however they're going to get it, like, are they going to sacrifice a day of food in order to fulfill what might have seemed to a lot of people like a public service campaign or a public relations campaign? And so that idea that it doesn't get at the kind of root and structural causes makes it feel more stunt-like, and yet at the same time, listening to Isaiah Thomas talk about it, he's so earnest. Yeah. And I think that earnestness is part of his charm in a lot of ways.
But he's 25, and he's a celebrity and he has money. And so there's something about youth and fame and wealth that are almost a toxic combination sometimes.
Absolutely.
But that he is unable, I think there's a myopia there about the experiences that he came from. Like, he doesn't realize that, like, his opportunity is like winning the lottery in a lot of ways, that he is the exception, that he is not the norm, and that people are constantly battling these really oppressive systems that don't allow them to just make certain choices very, frivolously. Okay, today, no crime. I mean, even the symbolism of it, the idea that, we're going to keep all of our lights on, we're going to keep the business lights on, as almost a metaphor of, like, shedding light on the problem, but also keeping our lights on as a way of saying we're going to make sure that what's done in the dark might not happen if there are lights on at every business or every home or what have you.
I would push back on one thing, Kellie, which is that I think Isaiah is aware that it's like winning the lottery. I mean, he had people, his own brothers who went to jail and were addicted to drugs. And I think the thing that's just so kind of confusing to me about it, that we've all kind of been circling around, is like there is a kind of core nonsensicalness to this. Like, and Isaiah just, he understands all of this stuff, and yet he was still embodying it and still moving forward with it and going out and having these conversations that you are definitely right in saying, Kellie, it's just like, ultimately, how does this apply to this teenager's life in Detroit? Maybe, I mean, he was showing them that he cared, I guess, which is not something. But, and then people should, I would love for people just to listen to the whole arc of the episode, but I do ask him at the end about whether it was a failure, and I do ask him and George Muirhead, the public information director, about like whether they really anticipated that there could be no crime, and their answers are definitely interesting, I would say.
But even at the time, I think the mayor is kind of quoted as saying in 86 as saying, of course there's not going to be, no one expects this appeal to have a direct impact on crime, but it's at least trying to bring people together. Can you paint a little bit more picture of kind of like what the campaign was and how it spread out that day, and whether people in Detroit really were aware of it? Was it notable, or was it just this kind of PR stunt off to the side? But we've sort of hinted at, obviously, the idea of No Crime Day, the idea of turning lights on, but just like describe that day itself.
Yeah, so the lead up, there was a big PR push around it. It was written about everywhere, New York Times, LA Times, all the major outlets, as well as being covered enormously in Detroit local media. Isaiah and Coleman Young were on the Today Show the day before. And so there was certainly an awareness around the country and in Detroit that this was happening. The day itself was a march. It was a rally. A bunch of dignitaries spoke at the rally, in addition to Isaiah Thomas and Magic Johnson, who's from Michigan and was a huge star and came from, the LA to be there. And then, as Kellie mentioned, there's also this campaign to keep your lights on at night as a kind of a show of citywide solidarity. There were something like 15,000 people at the rally, which is, I don't know how big the capacity is in the Pistons arena, but maybe less than for a Pistons playoff game. But Detroit is a large city, and so that's what, like 1% of people in Detroit who were there, but people also, caravanned from their neighborhoods. And so I think that there was awareness. I can't tell you if everybody in the city knew about it, but Isaiah did go out to schools all over the city. Yeah. He spent a lot of time working on this that summer in the NBA offseason, for sure.
This is a, notoriously sort of apolitical time for the NBA, or a time when I think, politics is not, and, there's famously, Michael Jordan shying away from politics and so forth. I don't think people really think of Isaiah Thomas as a political figure in this way. I mean, did this recast your notion of who Thomas was and what kind of activism athletes were taking on in this era?
He famously has a kind of rivalry with Michael Jordan, kind of on the court and off the court. They don't particularly have much love for each other. And so I asked him about that, and he was like, I wasn't going to bring it up, but like I chose to use my platform in this way. And certain other people certain other people used their platform in another way. And he spoke of it as like, no, I wasn't making any kind of conscious decision in the 80s because I grew up, my mother marched with Martin Luther King. I got free breakfast from the Black Panthers growing up in Chicago. Like, he was like, I always had a political consciousness. But you're right. Like, I think our image of him is the like smiling guy on commercials and stuff if you watch basketball in the 80s. But no, he's definitely like, yeah, this was always who I am. Why would you suggest anything otherwise? And we should say, like, also, Isaiah was extremely sincere in this case, and I think shouldn't necessarily be mocked. I mean, it's certainly up to you. He did, there was a big sexual harassment judgment against him when he was running the Knicks. He is like not a perfect figure, but in this case, I think he was coming from a genuine place of like, I want to do something to help this city.
But did he connect it to, I'm genuinely curious about kind of other work. Did he connect it to other, because, you can do something like this and it can come off as naive or PR-y or whatever, or a blip. But if, you're doing a bunch of other work behind the scenes, then, it's just part of your overall work. Or do you get the sense that like Isaiah and other athletes of this era were like doing this and that was checking their kind of like, I care about the community box, and then they were moving on?
I think I would think it's not dissimilar from things that other athletes were doing at the time. Like, in looking at clips, I would run across things like a charity game to raise money for the United Negro College Fund or something like that. Like, it's not hugely dissimilar from that, but I think the difference is that he set himself up to be mocked and to be criticized when inevitably there was crime. Like, he put himself out there, and maybe that was not savvy, maybe he didn't care, but like, I think the one thing that would unify most kind of athletes and athlete endeavors like this are that they were risk-free, right? It's just like raising money for a charity or something. And this was not that.
Yeah. And it's probably not fair to ask Isaiah Thomas, who's a basketball player, to be a policymaker or to be a politician in that way. Okay, come up with a jobs program. Come up with a public health program. Like, that's not his, that's not his assignment. I mean, like, he
brought attention to it. That's
that was the best that he, I won't say that's the best that he could do or all that he could do, but it was something that he was doing that was significant. That was more than what a lot of other people were doing. So sometimes I think we have unrealistic expectations of celebrities to, like, generate solutions that they have no expertise in developing.
Yeah. Well, Kylie Jenner gave that Pepsi. I mean, I feel like that was like, a real change.
And Isaiah and Coleman Young had a really interesting relationship. I didn't put this in the episode, but he said his two mentors when he moved to Detroit were Coleman Young, one of America's most prominent black mayors, and Aretha Franklin. And Coleman Young came in for a lot of criticism not necessarily particularly around this, but in that period, for being anti-gun control. And there was this kind of back and forth about why are you not making No Crime Day? There was a Freeze handgun group in Detroit. Why aren't you making that the centerpiece of this? And Coleman Young had a really interesting view of gun control, which is Detroit isn't going to unilaterally disarm itself when you have all these communities surrounding it, more predominantly white communities, and nobody's asking them to get rid of their guns. And so that was a really interesting back and forth. And Isaiah really didn't get involved too much in that. But Coleman Young loved to spar with the media. He's a really fascinating figure.
As we wrap up very, very quickly, I'm curious, can you just describe a little bit of the coverage and the response, and especially, I think some of the like more distasteful, snarky response? I mean, what was it like going back to that?
The headline in the New York Times the next day, and the piece, amazingly enough, was written by Isabel Wilkerson.
Yes. I noticed that. I was about to see it in your notes. Yes. The byline, Isabel Wilkerson, incredible. But the headline was?
The lead of the piece was, I don't remember the exact wording, but it was about how the killing of a police officer mars No Crime Day. The word Mars was in there.
Detroit killing Mars, No Crime Day.
Right. So that was kind of the tenor of a lot of the coverage. In local media, you had sidebars about like people come out to celebrate No Crime Day and things of that nature. But in terms of national media, it was like, oh, I guess Detroit couldn't do it. They kind of lived down to our expectations. And then there was like an interesting aside in a piece about Isaiah, a feature that came out a few years later that mentioned kind of how he'd been stung by some of the criticism and said that on the streets of Detroit, there had been kind of bootleg merchandise mocking No Crime Day that showed dead bodies and guns and stuff. And so that kind of that was, I guess, one aspect of the street level response. But Isaiah, he wanted to do this interview. He is proud of it, of the effort, and I think looks back at it as part of his, as we were saying before, what he perceives as a long career of kind of social justice activism. And so I don't think he looks at it as like a thing he's embarrassed about or even close to that.
Yeah. Well, this is such a great example of what you do in the series, picking sometimes stories that have been forgotten, but that tap into much larger stories. You want to tease a couple of the other things that you get at in the 1986 season, which as of right now is fully out. Listeners, the whole thing is out there. You can go find
The last episode is out on Thursday.
There you go.
And we've got 7 episodes in this season on 1986. I did one on Al Capone's Vault, the biggest television event
Excellent.
of 1986, and which was very fun. And then our senior producer, Evan Chung, did just a really amazing and beautiful piece on the Challenger explosion, interviewing 3 of the teachers who were in competition with Krista McAuliffe to get on the shuttle. And it's mostly non-narrated. It's a really beautiful use of the medium. It's just a great audio storytelling. So I'd encourage folks to check that out if they know about the Challenger or if they don't.
All right. Well, go listen to 1 Year, 1986, hosted by Josh Levin and produced by his great team. But thank you so much for doing this, Josh.
Thanks, Jody, Niki, Kellie. Appreciate it.
Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
September 27th is No Crime Day. You deserve a break this day. I ask on this day that we all chill and make it a crime-free city. I'm asking the dope man on this day, don't sell dope. I'm asking you who steals for a living, on this day, don't steal. I'm asking you who kills for a living, on this day, let him live. September 27th, it's time for no crime.
Radiotopia.